Good vibes and bad decisions. Oh, good vibes and bad decisions. Doopsie says check the facts. Quinn says tell me that again. Good vibes and bad decisions.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Good Vibes and Bad Decisions. This is what everybody has been waiting for. This is Whitechapel Weekend. I am Quinn, always here for the win. And this is Gypsy. Say hi, Gypsy.
Hello. Hi.
Together, we're going to co-host this amazing weekend event for you guys, okay? Whitechapel Weekend is all things Jack the Ripper related. Absolutely everything. Gypsy has went so deep into the research for this case that it is going to be a brammer. How are you feeling, Gyps, now all the investigating is done and it is time to just sit here and tell all our friends all about it?
I'm really excited because I think some of the stuff that I've uncovered is it's out there for like ripperologists and
Mhm.
criminologists and things, but it's not stuff that's really in the public forum.
Mhm.
So we found some quite interesting things.
We absolutely did find some interesting things. I'm going to jump into a few little bits before I hand it over to the other half of my whole heart and soul and my whole twin flame. So, before we go into that, I want to let everybody know, okay, that hell knows your triggers, and that's why it sends people down to press on them. Never feed what's fighting you. Your silence starves everyone's strategy, and your peace is your only weapon. Okay, guys? Do not let anything disturb your peace. This weekend edition of Good Vibes and Bad Decisions will have pictures of death, real dead bodies, dead prostitutes. This is a massive trigger warning for anyone who is listening who is triggered by things like this. You do not have to unfollow us. We have a whole bunch more videos on the page. We will not be offended if you choose to step away from this one and hop on to another one, or if you want to wait and catch us through the week. We have absolutely zero offence taken on that. Your mental health and your mental well-being is more important than anything. Okay, so we thank all of you guys for your support and we wish you the best weekend ever. And we hope that you enjoy this podcast as much as we enjoyed making it. Okay, so guys, roses have both petals and thorns, my dark flower. You needn't believe something weak because it appears delicate. Show the world your bravery. Okay, and Jack the Ripper, the question who? Inquiring minds still want to know, and so the media still do. More sequels to this crime buzz show. A killer slashed some prostitutes and wrote some letters to the press. This Jack had all the attributes to tease the public to excess. The murders were never solved. Good. For many who have, over time, jacked and ripped all the cash they could to profit from this unsolved crime. Jack the Ripper became the name to play Unsolved in this murder game. So remember, as we go through this Whitechapel weekend, death themed, all dark, all death, all gore, all guts, all the things that you guys are asking for. So we're going to sit on the sofa, we're going to pull up a duvet, we're going to get a drink, we're going to cuddle in together, and we're going to listen. Okay? So sleep, my love, sleep. The night is long, the hush is deep. Lay your head, the stars grow dim, and come with me and follow them. The winds forget, the earth is still, the aching hands have lost their will. No voices call, no footsteps fall, and nothing lingers, nothing at all. Sleep, my love, sleep. The night is long and the hush is deep. All you wear will fade like rain, but hush, my love, you'll feel no pain. The rivers sigh, the moonlight wanes, no need for sorrow, no need for names. The world moves on, the stories cease. Rest, my love, just rest in peace. Sleep, my love, sleep. The night is long, the hush is deep. Close your eyes and hold your breath, for gypsies here to bring the death.
That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you.
You are very, very
I loved
welcome.
it. I loved it. So, I just want to say before we get started that there is two parts. Part one, obviously, and part two. But also, there is going to be a bonus episode dropping on Sunday night. And this is a very personal episode for me, and all will become clear then. But I hope that everyone enjoys the story of the Ripper Files.
Get cozy, guys. Come and snuggle in.
So, we're going to get started. In the autumn of 1888, a shadow fell over London's East End. The crowded streets of Whitechapel were already famous for poverty, crime, and desperation, but between August and November, a series of brutal murders transformed the district into a setting of one of history's greatest unresolved mysteries. The killer became known as Jack the Ripper, a name taken from the letters sent to the press during the panic. Before history knew them as the victims of Jack the Ripper, they were simply people trying to survive in Victorian London. The five women most commonly linked to the murders are Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. They lived in the poverty-stricken streets and lodging houses of Whitechapel. Most had experienced hardship, unstable employment, homelessness, alcoholism, or the breakdown of family relationships. In a city that often overlooked the poor, they lived on society's margins, fighting day by day for food, shelter, and safety. Mary Ann Nichols, known to friends as Polly, was 43 years old when she was killed. She had once lived a more stable life with her husband and children, but years of financial difficulties and personal struggles left her living in common lodging houses in the East End. Like many women in her circumstances, she sometimes turned to casual prostitution to earn enough money for a bed and a meal. Annie Chapman was 47 and had also endured a difficult decline from a respectable working-class life. Following the breakdown of her marriage, poor health, and financial hardship, she found herself living hand-to-mouth in Whitechapel. Those who knew her often described her as sociable and resilient despite the challenges she faced. Elizabeth Stride was born in Sweden and had come to London in search of opportunity. By 1888, she too was living in poverty. Unlike some of the other victims, she was known amongst acquaintances as a woman who made efforts to maintain her appearance and dignity despite her circumstances. Her life had been marked by hardship, but also by determination to keep going. Catherine Eddowes was 46 years old and known for her intelligence and sense of humour. She spent much of her life moving between jobs and lodging houses, often struggling with poverty. Those who knew her remembered her as lively and quick-witted, characteristics that can sometimes be lost beneath the shadow of the crime that entered her life. The youngest of the five was Mary Jane Kelly. Much about her early life remains uncertain, adding to the mystery surrounding her story. Historians believe she was in her 20s and that she had moved through various parts of Britain before settling in Whitechapel. Friends described her as attractive, friendly, and sociable. Unlike the other canonical victims, she had a small room of her own, offering a fragile measure of privacy in an otherwise difficult life. For Inspector Frederick Aberline and the detectives working on the case, these women were not just names in police reports. They were the human faces of a growing terror that had gripped Whitechapel. As the murders mounted and the public fear intensified, their stories became intertwined with one of the great unsolved mysteries in criminal history. Yet behind the legend of Jack the Ripper were five real lives. lives shaped by poverty, resilience, and the daily struggle to survive in Victorian London's East End. As the autumn of 1888 unfolded in Whitechapel, investigators began to notice a chilling pattern. The women who would later become known as the Canonical Five, victims all suffered fatal throat wounds, suggesting a consistent method of killing. Yet each crime scene revealed subtle differences that seemed to show the killer's growing confidence and brutality. The first victim, Mary Ann or Polly Nichols, was found in Bucks Row on the morning of August the 31st. Her throat had been cut, and investigators also discovered injuries to her abdomen. The post-mortem examination concluded that the throat wounds had caused the catastrophic blood loss and were the immediate cause of death. Just over a week later, Annie Chapman was discovered in the backyard of a lodging house. Like Nichols, she had suffered fatal throat injuries. However, the examination revealed more extensive abdominal mutilation, and some internal organs had been removed. To the detectives working the case, the similarities between the two murders were becoming impossible to ignore. Then came the night of September the 30th, 1888, the infamous double event. The first victim, Elizabeth Stride, was found with a fatal wound to her throat, but notably lacked the extensive injuries seen in earlier cases. Some investigators and later historians speculated that the killer may have been interrupted before he could continue his attack. Less than an hour later, Catherine Eddowes was discovered elsewhere in the East End. Her injuries were markedly more severe. Alongside the fatal throat wounds were abdominal mutilations, facial injuries, and evidence that internal organs had been removed. For police, the similarities to the Chapman murder reinforced the belief that they were hunting a single offender. The final canonical victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was murdered on November the 9th. Unlike the others, she was killed indoors in a small room on Dorset Street. Investigators found the most extensive injuries of all of the canonical cases. Historians generally believed that the private setting gave the murderer far more time than he had enjoyed on the streets of Whitechapel. Despite the severity of the injuries, her throat wounds are still thought to have been the initial fatal attack. I just want to have a chat with you, Quinn, about the original five
Yeah,
before we go on. What do you make of because there's quite a difference, I think, between the five. You know, some were mutilated, others weren't. What do you think about those five victims?
I think when it comes to the original five, I think everything about them basically has been untold, right? So we
Mm.
know their names, right? And we know that obviously, I do think that not all of them, I don't think, were suggested to be sex workers, right? I think that some of them were actually, I think one of them was widowed. I read somewhere one of them was
Yeah,
widowed.
there was two that were widowed, but also in Victorian London, and we'll go on to discuss it later on. I think it's in part two actually.
Yeah,
But in order to be labelled as a prostitute in the Victorian era by police and by authorities, all you had to be was working class and out
really.
after dark. Yeah,
That's
you
actually
didn't even
wild.
have to be guilty of sex work at all.
Yeah, I did because I did read that one of them was homeless somewhere as well.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they all were. I know one was homeless and one I think was widowed, or one may have been homeless and widowed, if that makes any sense. But
Yeah, I know that they went between lodging houses and
hmm
were just like, whenever they could get some money together, they would get a room for the night. But that was often going to be a room that they were sharing with multiple other families, you know?
And I think it's really hard when you look at the victims of the Ripper, especially the original five, right? When you look at these victims, a lot of people want to concentrate on how they died and not how they lived.
Hmm.
And I think
Yeah.
that these women then become a sort of like a poster for Jack the Ripper, if you like, rather than learning about them and who they were. I don't think there's enough, like what I have found from reading into this and going over the investigation files that you sent me was that there actually is so much information about how these people were killed, but there's very little to go on about how they live and the lives that they led. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, working class women were considered the lowest of the low. You know, not only were they female, but they were also working class. So therefore, they were like on the fringes of society. So they
Yeah,
were misnomers as
it's
far
very
as
macabre.
authorities were concerned.
Yeah, how all the information and sort of the way it's all been laid out for any sort of ripperologist to go and find, or any layman like me, because that, but all of the things I've read, it's written in a really macabre way. It's
Yeah,
nothing I have found has stood out to me about the lives these women led, about family members they had, about it is
yeah,
literally like you said, if you were considered sort of lower class, if you were this or that. Uh, some of it's astonishing, if I'm being honest.
yeah,
Like the amount, and I think, right, we know more about Jack the Ripper and we don't know who he is than we know about the original five.
yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think that speaks for itself, really.
Before we follow the trail of the Whitechapel murders, we need to
Mhm.
meet the man who would become the face of the investigation,
Let's go.
Inspector Frederick Aberline. By 1888, Aberline was already a seasoned detective with the Metropolitan Police. Having spent years working in Whitechapel, he knew the area's maze of narrow streets, crowded lodging houses, and struggling communities better than most officers. His reputation was built on practice, experience, and an intimate knowledge of the East End. When the murders began, Scotland Yard turned to a detective who understood Whitechapel from the inside. When the early police force was first introduced to London, many members of the public viewed it with suspicion and distrust. Before 1829, law enforcement was largely carried out by local constables and unpaid watchmen, and many people feared that a professional police force would threaten their freedoms. Some worried that the government was creating a force similar to those used in authoritarian regimes in Europe, which were often seen as tools of political control. Despite these concerns, growing crime, overcrowding, and social unrest in rapidly expanding London highlighted the need for more effective policing. Sir Robert Peel, then the Home Secretary, argued that a disciplined, organised police force should could prevent crime rather than simply to react to it. As a result, the Metropolitan Police Act was passed in 1829, creating the Metropolitan Police Force. The officers, nicknamed Peelers or Bobbies after Sir Robert Peel, wore blue uniforms to distinguish them from the military and to reassure the public that they were civilians rather than soldiers. Initially, they often faced hostility, ridicule, and even physical attacks while on patrol. However, as peelers proved effective in reducing crime and maintaining public order, attitudes gradually changed. Over time, the force gained greater public acceptance and became the model for modern policing throughout Britain and many other countries around the world. So there's just a little bit of history of the British police force because it was still very much in its infancy
Yeah,
until
definitely, especially back then. And I'm pretty sure, like, they had sort of developed their own way then. It was kind of like a martial law, wasn't
yeah,
it?
but they
Back
they
then.
weren't preventing crimes so much as reacting to crimes that had already been committed.
Yeah.
Whereas Metropolitan Police Force, their remit was to prevent crime before it happens, rather than to react after it had. Um, as fear spread through London's East End, Aberline found himself at the centre of one of the most infamous criminal investigations in history. Night after night, he and his fellow detectives chased witness statements, investigated suspects, and sifted through rumours that seemed to multiply with every passing day. Yet, despite their efforts, the killer remained frustratingly elusive. The investigation would ultimately focus on 5 women whose murders shared disturbing similarities. Each victim suffered fatal wounds to the throat, and in 4 of the cases, investigators found additional mutilations that suggested a single offender may have been responsible. As the pattern emerged, so too did the legend of a killer the world would come to know as Jack the Ripper. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the case because I think it's been done to death.
You know what? Yeah, people have. They've literally went on and on about it, and I think that people focus on the same thing, Gypsy. People seem
Yeah.
to focus on the same parts of the investigation. And we actually had a comment on one of our videos today that actually praised us for doing it differently, didn't they? They were
Yeah,
quite.
we do tend, like we like to come at it from a different angle. So we're looking at it from how the people lived at the time, what their social status would have meant for them at that time as well. We're going to talk about that, and also all of the stuff around the case that was going on.
Mhm.
Because we all know the case, everybody knows the case, everybody knows the ins and outs of the case. So I'm going to touch on it, but I'm not going to go too deeply into it. For detectives such as Frederick Aberline, the pattern was clear. Each victim had suffered fatal wounds to the throat, while 4 of the 5 also showed abdominal mutilation. The removal of organs from some victims led to speculation that the murderer possessed at least some anatomical knowledge, a question that remains debated by historians to this day. More than a century later, the identity of the killer remains unknown, but the evidence left behind at those 5 crime scenes continues to shape one of the most enduring mysteries in criminal history. These women were killed within a relatively small area of Whitechapel. So several suffered extensive mutilations, leading to investigators to speculate about the killer's knowledge of anatomy. Though experts have long disagreed on whether any special medical skill was involved. So, one thing I did come across was there were other women in that time that could potentially have been Ripper victims. So, I just want to talk to you about them for a minute, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So, when discussing Jack the Ripper, attention usually focuses on the canonical 5: Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Yet the Whitechapel murder investigation was never limited to those 5 women. Police investigated a wider series of killings between 1888 and 1891, known collectively as the Whitechapel murders.
And am I right? And sorry, am I right in that 2 of the victims were actually found on the same day?
That was Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. They are
That's
part
right,
of the
yeah.
canonical 5. Yeah.
Yeah. See, do you see what I mean, guys? Like, this is the sort of information that you're not going to find in your regular Ripper files. This is, people are going in and talking about Jack the Ripper and all the things that they know about Jack and all of the people that Jack might be. Whilst we will cover that, Gypsy will cover that, there is going to be certain things that you find in this podcast and this whole Whitechapel Weekend event that actually
There was
maybe you
actually
never knew.
there was actually less than an hour between those 2 murders.
And that is, and were they geographically close then? They must have been.
Yeah, very close.
Yeah,
He literally whipped round the corner. Yeah, very close. So I think that one of them at least was maybe planned, and the other was just a
spontaneous.
question of availability.
That's so sad, right? For your death to
She
be
tripped
down
and fell
to,
into Jack the Ripper's grips.
yeah. Can you imagine that though? Can you imagine the reason you died was because of spontaneity?
So some of the victims have at various times been linked to Jack the Ripper, although historians remain divided on whether they were murdered by the same hand. So a lot of these women that I'm going to talk about were murdered at the same time, geographically within a reasonable distance from the Whitechapel murders. Because don't forget, um, London's a big place, but it's not actually geographically that big,
Yeah.
you know? So I want to talk to you first about Emma Elizabeth Smith,
Okay.
okay? Murdered in April 1888, Elizabeth Smith was brutally assaulted and later died from her injuries. Her death occurred before the first canonical Ripper murder, and was originally believed to have been the work of a local gang rather than a lone serial killer, although some writers have included her among possible Ripper victims. Most researchers today consider her case separate from the Ripper murders. The next lady we've got is Martha Tabram. Martha Tabram was found on a landing in George Yard buildings. She had been stabbed dozens of times, and her murder occurred just weeks before Mary Ann Nichols was killed, and is often regarded as the strongest candidate for an additional Ripper victim. Some researchers believe Tabram may have been the killer's first murder, before he developed the method seen in later attacks. Others point out that her wounds differ significantly from those of the canonical victims.
So is this like him evolving?
Potentially, yeah. Because we don't listen, we know about those 5 murders, but we also know about we talked in an episode the other day about chaos killings, right?
Yeah, we did, yeah.
Where people don't always stick to their MO. MO means modus operandi, which means the way that your hand moves, literally
And
means the
they
way that your hand moves.
basically, yeah, it's a repeated pattern.
We're going to go on to Rose Milet. Rose Milet's body was discovered several weeks after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. Authorities disagreed over whether she had been strangled or died accidentally. Because her injuries differed from the established Ripper pattern, most modern historians regard this case as doubtful, though police initially considered a possible connection. Then we have Alice Mackenzie. Alice Mackenzie was found with wounds to her throat in Whitechapel. The similarity of those injuries prompted an immediate comparison to the earlier Ripper murders, as she was found in 1889. Investigators debated whether the attack represented a return of the Ripper after months of silence, or the work of an entirely different killer. The question remains unsolved. Then we have the Pinchin Street torso. Unfortunately, this little love was never identified. The body was discovered in September 1889, so 1 year after the canonical Ripper murders. One of the most mysterious cases linked to the Whitechapel investigation involved a female torso found beneath a railway arch in Pinchin Street. Unlike the canonical Ripper murders, the body had been dismembered. Some investigators suspected a link, while others believed it belonged to a separate series of so-called Thames torso murders, and we will be covering that in a future episode, that occurred in London during the same period. Most modern researchers consider this case distinct from Jack the Ripper. The Thames torso murders were a series of unsolved killings in Victorian London between 1887 and 1889, in which the dismembered remains of several women were discovered in and around the River Thames. The crimes became known as the torso murders because the victims' bodies were often cut apart and scattered, making identification difficult. The 4 principal cases are the Raynham Mystery, the Whitechapel Mystery, the murder of Elizabeth Jackson, and the Pinchin Street torso murder. They were linked by similarities in the way that bodies were dismembered and disposed of. Only one victim, Elizabeth Jackson, was positively identified. The murders occurred at roughly the same time as the infamous Jack the Ripper killings, leading some to speculate about connection. However, investigators and later researchers generally regard them as separate series because the methods differed significantly. The Thames torso killer focused on dismemberment and concealment of the bodies, whereas Jack the Ripper's victims were largely left intact at the crime scenes. Despite extensive investigations, no suspect was ever convicted, and the identity of the killer or killers remains one of Victorian London's enduring mysteries. So we will go into those on another episode, I think, because it's
Yeah.
quite a fascinating
And
case. And
again, guys, you know, there's going to be some pictures on the screen in this
yeah,
podcast that some viewers may find a bit too disturbing. And again, that's okay. And if you've gotten this far and you are now starting to get triggered, or if you get triggered at any point during this podcast, your mental well-being will always come first to us. Okay, so thank you for supporting us this far. And if you are able to continue, then sit beside me and let's go over the rest of the facts.
So I want to talk about a lady called Frances Coles now. Now, she was murdered in February 1891. So it would have been about 2.5 years after the Ripper murders.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a few years after the Ripper murders, right?
Yeah. So Frances Coles is often described as the final Whitechapel murder victim. So what they did was they took the Ripper murders and every other murder that happened in Whitechapel over that period of time and clumped them together into what they called the Whitechapel murders.
Right, okay, and that would be
Some
what the
cases,
TV
some are,
series is based off and all these things, right?
yeah. So some are Ripper cases, some are other cases belong to other people, but we don't know. These are all people who were killed, and no one's ever been discovered as
Yeah.
the culprit for any of these.
So all the
Um,
people that are, that fit the bracket, people that fit the mold, the suspects, as it's all speculated, all of it is speculated, and some of the people it is thought to be, are died innocent and were presumed guilty by people because you know what word of mouth is like when people talk, people, they judge straight away. People will judge. So there
yeah.
is, and a lot of people get really carried away with this, guys. A lot of people try and solve the Ripper murders, and they do all this. And you're talking, this was in what, 1880, whatever, 1885, 1886.
Yeah, it was the first canonical Ripper murder was in 1888, but it would be churlish to believe that that was the first ever murder that that person
Exactly.
committed. Because as we know, killers evolve.
And I think we
People.
both know that it's not going to, this case ain't going to be solved, right? It's never going to be
Oh
solved.
no, it's absolutely never going to be solved. But what I've done is I went through coroner's reports of from that time. I looked at young women and also women and young and older, like older teenage girls who were attacked at that time, and also girls that were attacked at that time. And I've included them all because there's absolutely no way to say that um, any one of them wasn't an additional victim.
And this is what makes
So
this podcast different, right? This is what makes us different from other people because, every time you watch something on Jack the Ripper, whether it be a documentary, whether it be even a series on Netflix based on true events and all of these things, it is all speculation. But a lot of people
yeah,
are just leaving everybody out because they focus on the Chronicle 5, or they'll add a few people in, but mainly focus on the 5. And there is no way to say who was and who wasn't, right? But what Gypsy has done is she has taken a possibility, a wide range of possibilities, and instead of excluding anyone, she's included everyone. Because why not? Right? This is all
these
speculative
victims'
anyway.
names need to be heard.
Hmm.
Murder was rife in that time.
Hmm.
And these women, their names deserve to be heard. Their stories deserve to be heard, regardless of whether they were killed by Jack the Ripper. They still suffered at the hands of another human being. And
Hmm.
if these are ones that could potentially be loosely tied to Jack the Ripper, but also are very probably not one of his victims. But we don't know, which is why I've included them. I'll just go back to Frances Coles really quickly. So a suspect was actually arrested in connection with her murder, though the case against him was it eventually collapsed. Whether Coles fell victim to the Ripper or another killer remains one of the enduring mysteries of the Whitechapel murders. So the existence of these unconfirmed victims highlights a crucial truth about Jack the Ripper. No one can say with complete certainty how many women the killer murdered. So I just want to talk about more lesser known cases
Right?
of the murder of young and vulnerable women at the time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're starting with Louisa Smith.
Right.
She was a sex worker born in 1855, and she was discovered in Algernon Road in Lewisham in the early hours of the 10th of February 1889.
And is that close
Lewisham is
to? I was
it's a
just gonna say.
distance, but it's doable,
Right.
It's a distance, but you can walk it,
Okay.
you know. Obviously, you can tell by my accent, I am from this neck of the woods, so I can tell you that it's doable.
Yep,
Um,
she definitely is. If you cannot tell from her accent, she says, she's all right, mate, if you can't tell by my accent, I've slapped me Harris and I'm gonna get up the what is it? up the apples and pears, and I'm gonna go and lay down my Harris on my bed after my Ruby Murray and my rub a dub dub. Like, if you cannot tell, are you serious, woman?
Well, I think my accent's kind of rounded out a bit since I've been out of London.
Bitch, you are like the Artful Dodger with boobs. Like what?
Okay, let's get back to Louisa Smith. We'll put the Artful Dodger to one side for
It's the
now.
same timeline. Don't play with me.
It is the same timeline.
Right,
So her
listen,
face
guys,
was
we do have a
bruised.
bit of a giggle when we do these
We
podcasts, all
do.
right? And it's not because we do not have any respect for the dead or anything like that. We have this channel so that we can vibe together, talk together, and do, go through these cases together. And we don't actually do it for anybody else except us. So the fact anybody listens is
No,
an absolute
it's
bonus.
nice if you guys listen, but we do it for ourselves. Um, Her face was bruised on the chin and forehead, and there was a cut at the back of her head. Post-mortem revealed a severely fractured skull, like her head was caved in.
Oh my God.
Tragically, she succumbed to her injuries at a workhouse infirmary in Lewisham on the night of February the 14th, 1889. So 4 days later. So now we have Amelia Fanny Case. Fanny is a very London term for someone whose name is Francis.
And can I just say that is not what it means in Scotland? It is
It's
actually
not what it means in London
a,
either.
yeah, it's a slang term for a vagina. I'm just saying, there's going to be loads of Scottish people watching this and they're going to want me to say it, right? So if I don't say it, I am letting all of the Scots down. So, I mean, back to Fanny now, please.
We'll just call her Amelia.
That'll do. Thank you.
Amelia Case was
See?
murdered in Whitechapel in 1892. I couldn't find any details of her murder beyond the event, which is in and of itself frankly shocking.
Yeah, that is
She,
actually shocking.
she is less frequently discussed, but sometimes appears in studies of East End violence against women. And then we have Annie Millwood. Annie Millwood was admitted to the Whitechapel Infirmary on February 25th, 1888. She had suffered multiple stab wounds to her legs and torso. The exact number of wounds is unknown. She stated that she was attacked by a man that she did not know, and that he had attacked her with a clasp knife he had previously concealed in his pocket. Annie Millwood later made full recovery, and she was released from hospital into the care of South Grove Workhouse on Mile End Road. And I've got a picture of that to put on the screen.
There we go.
Strangely, 10 days later, she collapsed and passed away while, in inverted commas, engaged in some occupation. She
Oh,
was in the workhouse, so she was probably scrubbing her life away in the laundry.
yeah.
Coroner Baxter headed the inquest on April the 5th and declared her death to be from sudden effusion to the pericardium from a rupture of the left pulmonary artery through ulceration,
And for the
which tells
less,
me
um,
which tells me that an ulceration is generally an infection,
right.
and the pulmonary artery is the artery that goes through your lungs. So there was probably some infection that caused the artery in her lung to become clogged, which killed her. This was listed as natural causes, although I can't help but think that there was some unidentified complication following her attack, because remember she was stabbed in her legs and torso, so it could have been a blood clot. It could have been, and that forensic science wasn't what it is today.
Well, that's it, and that's what we have to remember as well. We're talking about 1888, right? So, I mean, them even establishing motive would be astounding. Them even being able to figure out how it was done is astounding. So the fact that it was never solved is not shocking at all, actually.
She's occasionally discussed by Ripper researchers as a possible victim. Now, we've got Ada Wilson. Ada was a seamstress who survived a brutal knife attack on March the 28th, 1888, at her home at 19 Maidman Street in Bow. Now, as a seamstress, she would have she would have taken in customers in her living room, in her parlour. That would have been where she did her sewing.
Did you say she survived though?
Yeah.
Oh,
According to historical reports, she answered a knock on her door from a stranger who demanded money and threatened her life. When she refused, the man pulled a clasp knife and stabbed her twice in the throat. Her screams alerted neighbours and police. She survived the attack despite severe blood loss. Because the throat-cutting assault occurred months before the canonical Whitechapel murders, many historians and ripperologists suspect that the unidentified man may have been Jack the Ripper. Then we go to Annie Farmer. The attack on Annie Farmer took place on November the 21st, 1888, so after the canonical five, in a common lodging house on George Street in the Spitalfields area of London, which is East End adjacent to central London.
right, okay.
Just days after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. Fortunately, she survived the attack and was able to give police an account of the attack. Farmer claimed that a man accompanied her to her room and without provocation seized her and stabbed her in the throat with a penknife, also known as clasp knife. She fought back and screamed, prompting the assailant to flee. Miss Farmer was very lucky in that she suffered only a superficial wound to her throat.
Oh, wow.
Witnesses saw an unknown man with blood on his hands and mouth running from the lodging house and reportedly shouting, "Look what she has done." Authorities heavily suspected that Farmer's story was false and that she had invented the events to disguise her attempt to rob the man or during a state of extreme drunkenness. Yet another example of a working class woman being dismissed. Then we have Emma Vickers. Sadly, no information was recorded on this murder in public records, so the only information I have is that she was murdered in 1888 in Whitechapel. That's all the information I have.
And nothing more.
Nothing else. It's the only thing that was recorded.
That's wild.
And then we have Mary Seward. The 14-year-old Mary disappeared from West Road in West Ham, East London, in 1881. She became the first victim of a series of predatory crimes known as the West Ham vanishings. Her 4-year-old cousin had gone missing, and Mary went out around the neighbourhood to search for him. While the little boy eventually returned home safely on his own, Mary was never seen again. Mary was 4'6" tall, thin, pale, with dark brown hair, an irregular teeth, and a unique semicircular scar between her right cheek and cheekbone and ear. 9 months later, 12-year-old Eliza Carter disappeared under eerily similar circumstances. She lived at 39 Church Road, just 10 doors down from Mary Seward. She was last seen by a schoolmate around 5 p.m. after visiting her married sister. Locals, family and police dragged nearby ponds, searched empty basements and scoured the district. The very next day, Eliza's dress was discovered discarded in West Ham Park, with all its large black buttons intentionally cut off. Eliza is described as fair of complexion, blue eyes, and she was wearing small gold earrings and high lace boots. Amelia Jeffs was a 15-year-old girl who lived in West Road in West Ham, East London. On the evening of Friday the 31st of January, 1890, Amelia left her home with threepence, or as we would have called it back then, threepence, and
Threepence.
threepence, and a basket to go and buy fish and chips. A local schoolboy spotted her dawdling near a row of empty houses on the Portway, but she never made it to the shop. 2 weeks later, her body was found upstairs in a cupboard inside an unoccupied house at 126 Portway, facing West Ham Park. An inquest held at the King's Head Tavern revealed that she had been brutally violated and strangled with a scarf. Clara Sutton was a 14-year-old girl who vanished under identical circumstances. shortly before Amelia Jeffs did. Unlike Amelia, Clara's body was never recovered, grouping her with Mary Seward and Eliza Carter as the vanished victims. However, she belonged to the same tight-knit circle of friends and neighbours as Mary, Eliza and Amelia. All of the girls had vanished within the same few hundred yards of West Road. While there was a prime suspect for the girls' vanishings, ultimately their case was never solved. I recognise that the girls' disappearances are not in line with the Jack the Ripper modus operandi.
Uh-huh.
However, we do not fully understand who Jack was or how he operated, and I believe it would be churlish to dismiss a potential connection out of hand.
Yeah.
The suspect in this case, in the case of the West Ham vanishings, was only actually a suspect because he had been one of the builders who had worked on the Portway buildings and had a set of keys.
Oh,
No other non-circumstantial evidence was found, meaning that the girls and their families never saw any justice.
shock.
Florence Saunders was murdered in Peckham on the 22nd of August 1897. Police files note her cause of death as stabbing wounds. Because the attack took place south of the River Thames, it was handled by local Metropolitan Police Force officers rather than the Whitechapel investigators. No viable suspects were ever apprehended. Now, I can take an educated guess and say that that was either investigated, depending on where in Peckham it was, by Peckham Police Force
Yeah.
or by Carter Street, um, which was Carter Street used to be the police station when I was a kid. It's now Walworth Neck. It's been moved to a different place.
Right, okay.
That would have been investigated by Carter Street or by Peckham Police. So then we can come on to Mary Marshall. Mary Marshall was stabbed to death in Bethnal Green on October 22nd, 1897, exactly 2 months after Florence Saunders was killed. Her murder and the location being close to the area where the canonical five were killed led to public speculation that Jack had returned. Police found no direct forensic or physical links to the older cases. Like many working class women killed in late Victorian London, her death was eventually attributed to an unknown local assailant. Something to remember: unless the victims of these offences could be directly and unquestionably linked to Jack the Ripper, or gave solid credence that he had resurfaced, nobody was interested in solving these cases. A lack of resources applied to their investigations and disinterest from a social and political standpoint meant that a very minimal attempt was made to investigate or record what happened to these women. Jack's victims all fulfilled a social stereotype. They were women known to engage in prostitution, or maybe they weren't. Women occasionally using prostitution for survival, or women merely labelled as prostitutes by Victorian police or newspapers, or young working class women with no evidence of sex work. But there didn't need to be an evidence of sex work for them to be accused of being prostitutes. All they
Right.
had to be was working class and female.
Wow. That's actually shocking though, right? Be serious.
And also there was like lots of declarations about drunkenness. However, what we have to also understand is at that time, the water that was available to these women was full of cholera. It was filthy. It came from the Thames.
Wow.
And the only clean water that they had to drink was if they made tea, which was very, very expensive then. So only the hoi polloi would get tea. So
And he wasn't murdering, like, the thing is, like, all of the people that he has been accused of murdering or could have murdered would have a hard time being able to get a lot of alcohol though if they were as poor as being
alcohol,
described.
gin particularly was really, really cheap then.
Was it really?
Readily available. Yeah, it went in place of water or other drinks,
Wow,
unfortunately,
that's actually wild, right?
because the drinking water there was at that time it was full of bugs, disease, cholera. It was awful.
Oh, yuck.
However, all of the women and girls we have spoken about, including the young ladies in the final few cases, could be termed as any one or more of the criteria I have just spoken about. Just being working class was enough to mean that your case was looked at with a sideways glance, a few cursory notes taken, and a cause of death recorded. They may have even felt the collar of a few local villains and asked a few questions, but beyond that, in the cold light of day, while the working class women of London feared for their lives in an increasingly dangerous environment, their lives were considered to the powers that be disposable unless it could be tied to Jack. The historical record becomes increasingly patchy for the lesser-known murders, and many local cases survive only in newspaper archives and coroner's records, which is where I found a lot of these cases.
Yeah.
These were among the younger adult women whose death becomes notable unsolved cases in the East End during the late Victorian era. Was Martha Tabram the first victim? Did the Ripper return to kill Alice Mackenzie or Frances Coles? Did the notorious Jack have more than one method of slaughter? Or did the real killer claim only 5 lives before disappearing forever? More than 130 years later, historians still debate where Jack the Ripper's story truly begins and ends. The canonical 5 provide the strongest and most widely accepted narrative, but the shadows at the edges of the case remain crowded by other victims whose stories may never be fully understood. And therein lies one final mystery. Perhaps some of Jack the Ripper's victims have already been forgotten. Not because they weren't his victims, but because history can no longer prove that they were. When the Whitechapel murders began in 1888, London's Metropolitan Police Force was just 59 years old. Founded in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel, the force was still finding its footing in an age before fingerprints, forensic science, criminal profiling, or modern communications. Faced with a cunning killer stalking the fog-shrouded streets of the East End, the men of Scotland Yard were entering a battle unlike any they had ever encountered before. The Metropolitan Police in 1888 were experienced at investigating ordinary murders, but they were poorly equipped for the kind of serial killer investigation that the Ripper case became. The detectives were not incompetent, rather they were working at the limits of Victorian policing. Some key limitations included no fingerprinting. Scotland Yard did not adopt fingerprinting until 1901. Forensic science was in its infancy and yet was not yet an established part of police force investigations. Crime scene preservation was rudimentary at best. Bodies were often removed quickly to mortuaries and scenes cleaned, sometimes before detailed examinations could take place. Police had little ability to analyse physical evidence such as blood, hair, saliva, or other traces that modern investigators would consider crucial. Detectives relied heavily on witness statements, suspects' interviews, patrols, informants, and tracking victims' last known movements. The Criminal Investigation Department, CID, had only been established in 1878, 10 years before the Ripper murders, so detective work was still developing as a specialised profession. By 1888, London's police were nearly 60 years old, but murder investigation remained as much an art as a science. The detectives hunting Jack the Ripper worked in a world without fingerprints, DNA, crime scene tape, forensic laboratories, or criminal profiling. Their most valuable tools were their eyes, their instincts, and the testimony of frightened witnesses. Faced with a killer who left few clues and vanishing into the crowded streets of Whitechapel, the men of Scotland Yard were finding a modern monster with Victorian methods. Police attitudes towards working class women in Victorian London, especially poor women and prostitutes, were often shaped by a mixture of class prejudice, moral judgment, and paternalism. Victorian society placed great value on the ideal of the respectable woman, modest, domestic, and dependent upon a husband or family. Poor working class women often struggled to fit this ideal simply because they had to work, live in crowded conditions, or fend for themselves. As a result, they were frequently viewed with suspicion by middle class authorities, including police officers. Prostitution was commonly described in Victorian Britain as the great social evil. Many police officers and public officials regarded prostitutes not only as immoral, but also as a source of disorder, crime, and disease. The Contagious Disease Act of the 1860s gave authorities powers that disproportionately targeted women suspected of prostitution. Contemporary critics argued that the laws treated women as the problem while largely ignoring their male clients. The legislation brought police and medical authorities into direct regulation of suspected prostitutes. By 1888, many police officers working in districts such as Whitechapel would have encountered poverty, alcoholism, homelessness, and prostitution on a daily basis. Prostitutes were often seen as both victims of circumstance and habitual troublemakers, depending on the individual officer's outlook. The Charles Booth police notebooks reveal officers making personal observations and judgments about prostitution and those involved in it. When the Ripper murders began, one difficulty facing investigators was that the victims belonged to a social group that Victorian society often overlooked. Many of the women lived precarious lives, moving between lodging houses, casual work, and prostitution in order to survive. To many Victorians, a poor woman who found herself in the streets after dark was often judged before she was heard. Respectability was a luxury that poverty frequently denied. Police officers patrolling Whitechapel viewed prostitution through the lens of the Victorian morality as a social evil, a source of disorder, and a symptom of the poverty that engulfed the East End. Yet behind the labels and assumptions were real women, widows, wives abandoned by husbands, mothers struggling to feed their children, and labourers whose wages could not keep a roof over their heads. In the eyes of society, they were often invisible until the Ripper murders forced the world to notice them. So, before we go on to looking at the suspects, I just want to have a chat about how women were seen in Victorian London.
Yeah,
Well, in
definitely.
Victorian Britain, because it wasn't just confined to London. This was all over Britain. You know, Brits get a reputation as a buttoned-up society.
Yeah.
Doing what they do, and and that comes from Victorian Britain.
I think the sexism started way back then. Back then they never believed women could be anything else other than what they actually were, right? What they were allowed to be.
Hmm.
And I think, in a
But
way,
then, at that point, women still didn't have the vote. They couldn't own any property.
I think that we have a boom now in 2026 with this whole trad wife thing. And I think that
Hmm.
it goes to show very much that although it works for some, it's not something that should be placed on society as a whole. I think that
Yeah.
that is what started it, and that is what has led us to where we are now. And I think
Hmm.
that, each person individually should be able to choose how they lead their life and how they see other people. But we only have that freedom of expression now because of what women like this went through back then. you know,
Exactly.
it would not be like this now, and we would not have as much expression. Although a lot of people feel like some of their, freedom of speech is folded and, TV's propaganda. You think about how these women lived, think about what these women went through, and then tell me if you still feel like you're really hard done by as a female.
Yeah. I mean, you've got to remember also, this is about 20 years before the suffragette movement.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is 20 years before women stood up to get the vote, stood up to
Yeah,
be seen as equals. So it was a very different society to the one that we know today.
yeah, and I think that being able to sit here and have this open discussion, and we very much have an open mic on the podcast. That's why you'll see sometimes we'll have a whole conversation in between, you know parts of the investigation we're discussing and things like that, and it's because this is very much unscripted. This is just two best friends having a conversation, and all of the opinions in all of our podcasts are just simply that. They are our opinions, our own opinions. And I truly believe myself, although I lean more to the trad wife sort of thing, I like that sort of thing. I know you do as well. But
Yeah.
I do feel like, some things I do want independence on, some things I do want seen on, other things, I prefer to take a back seat and I prefer to be guided. And I think that
Yeah.
being able to have that choice though is
Yeah.
is only because women like that went through things like that. And
Yeah. Absolutely.
finding out now, like you saying a minute ago, Gypsy, that gin was so freely available because it was cheaper, is
Yeah.
wild to me. We live in a life now where alcohol is more expensive than water and all of these things. But to hear how they lived back then, we, again, I cannot say this enough. We are focusing on the people that lost their lives. We're not focusing on Jack. I know there has been talk of Jack and there will be, but you cannot discuss the
Yeah.
case without discussing him. But you can shift the focus, and that's what we aim to do. We did it with the other Trudy Adams, John Bonet, all these things,
Yeah.
focusing on the people who made it possible for people like us to have experiences like this should be what is done. We should not be focusing on the people that took that voice away from them. And this is the point of this podcast and all other podcasts.
Yeah. I mean, although we're going to be looking at suspects, we're also looking at why they were suspects.
Yeah, that's it. And do you know the thing is,
Just the environment at the time.
we had a conversation because obviously, guys, it's not just a case of, oh, do you want to just chat about this, right? Let's go on to the website, activate the cameras and get it done. It's not like that. You have to look into it, you have to do research, and we have to be comfortable with some of the topics that we're discussing because of course there can always be backlash, negative comments, things like that. Everybody's going to agree to disagree, but the one thing that I think, were both shocked on, equally as shocked, is one of the suspects is only a suspect because he knew one of the victims. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Don't
Yeah,
you
that's
think
correct.
that's wild? Like, don't you think that's
Yeah.
crazy? It just shows the lack of like detective work, the lack of
Hmm.
structure within what they, and you've got to think though, like Gypsy says, back then they were only starting Metropolitan Police, they were just building it. It was not actually something that was completely fully built, structured and in place. But still, to be able to be in a world where you can accuse someone of such horrific crimes because they know one of the people, I mean, that would narrow down a quarter of London if we were to go and do that now. And if police were to operate like that now, there would be complete and utter uproar, wouldn't there? You know,
Yeah, but, I mean, they'd be ridiculed now
hmm
because the society as a whole is so much more informed on science and forensics and things like that. But back then, you've got to think that there was no TV, there was no radio, there was no, you know, a lot of these people that were in the East End, the working class of East End, they couldn't read.
and the thing is, I want to, before we go on to our next segment, take a second to ask you a few questions. I want to know,
Hmm.
and I'm sure the listeners and stuff do, because you've done so much research for this case. Um, Out of the five, chronological victims, the famous five, out of those victims, is there any of them that you resonated with most reading about them?
Just, and to be honest, I resonated with all of them in some way, shape, or form because, I grew up in a working class family in that same part of London. I was literally, you could spit across the river and hit where I grew up from where these murders happened.
Yeah.
And you know, I it's been something that my whole life, don't go upstairs when the lights are off because Jack the Ripper will get you, and Jack the Ripper was a boogeyman type
That
person.
was what I was going to go and ask you next, Gypsy.
Yeah.
Jack the Ripper for you growing up was always a scary story, correct? Like it was always
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. It wasn't until we got older that we realized it was actually like a true case. It was for us. It was a story that we got frightened with when we were kids, like frightened to behave.
Like in Scotland, we were very much told, if you don't behave, you go to the Jaggy Jersey home, and
Yeah.
you go there. And the Jaggy Jersey home, For people that are not sure, is we were told that you go to a children's home and they make you wear itchy woolly jumpers with no t-shirt and it scratches you all day. So it was named the Jaggy Jersey Home, and all children from Scotland were frightened because if they did something bad, they would go to the Jaggy Jersey Home. Very much
Yeah.
like Gypsy saying, if you don't comply, Jack the Ripper will get you. So these are, pivotal parts of people's lives, and these are ghost stories, and I don't know another word for it, paranormal stories or a frightening story that
Yeah.
children were told to scare them. These
Yeah.
women's actual murders were being used as a way to frighten children into behaving and complying, because it stopped being seen as a crime and it started at some point evolving into a story. And that's
Yeah. It
why.
became a legend rather than an event. Yeah.
Right, that's it. And I think for me it's taken the seriousness, and for a lot of people in my generation, especially I think in younger, learning about the case, I think that hearing the stories about it actually did turn it into a kind of scary bedtime story, and it took the seriousness off the fact that these were actual murders. It was more like a storybook to my generation. And I know that there actually is generations under me, my children, for sure would not know who Jack the Ripper was if you asked them. They would have no clue about who it was, because I think that these old stories, if you like, are starting to die.
Yeah, they are. They're starting to die out. So I do have the top 10 suspects.
Are we going to get to go over the suspects and play
Yeah.
detective? Let's go. Right, guys, come
I
on.
I found the top 10 suspects,
Right, you've
but
had enough time to refill your drinks. You've had enough time to go outside and have a shot of that vape. Get your bum back on the sofa with me, and let's go over the suspects with this beautiful lady.
so over the years, more than 100 suspects, and by some counts, more than 500 have been proposed. Most theories remain speculative. So let's examine the top suspects. Okay, we've got the top 10. Suspect number one is the policeman's favourite. This is the guy that the police decided was the man who did it, and his name is Aaron Kaminsky. Imagine a nervous young Polish immigrant wandering Whitechapel's streets. Aaron Kaminsky was a barber who lived in the area and later entered a mental asylum. Many modern researchers consider him one of the strongest historical suspects because senior police officials later referred to a Polish Jewish suspect believed to be the killer. However, the evidence is circumstantial and no contemporary court ever charged him. He was suspected because he lived locally and had documented mental health issues. However, there was no direct evidence linking him to the murders. So he was suspected because he lived nearby and he'd had mental health issues.
This is actually wild. This is again what we were talking about the guy knowing the woman and then being, put on a suspect list. If this was to happen today, there'd be a write up everywhere and people would be going off their conks.
Yep.
Do you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
they would.
It's bizarre that you can be considered a suspect for something so silly, but that was one. We've got nine more to go, I believe, babe.
Yeah, we have. So suspect number two, the barrister in the Thames, Montague John Druitt. Druitt was a barrister and schoolmaster whose body was found in the River Thames shortly after the final canonical murder. Some police officials later regarded him as the leading suspect, partly because of his apparent suicide coinciding with the end of the murders. This coincidence has kept his name near the top of suspect lists for over a century. He came under police scrutiny simply because his death came shortly after the murders ceased. However, there was no proven connection to Whitechapel at all at the time of the murders. So he never even went to Whitechapel, but because he killed himself right after they happened, he was on the suspect list.
Wow, that's actually
Suspect number
wild.
right. Suspect number three, the disappearing con man. I feel like these should be tarot cards.
Right? It actually does sound like that.
The disappearing con man, Michael Ostrog. Michael Ostrog was a career criminal, thief, and con man who drifted across Europe. His criminal history attracted police attention and he appeared in some later suspect memoranda, yet modern researchers often regard the case against him as weak. He became a suspect because of his violent criminal reputation. However, there was very little evidence linking him directly to the murders. So he's a bit rowdy. We'll put him on the in the box of suspects.
I'm not laughing, right? I am laughing because it's funny. I'm not going to lie. I just think this is crazy. And I just think if I was sat there with a police officer and they came up to me and that was the reason he was putting me on a list to be murdering people, I'd be sat there and I'd be like, maybe you should be on the list because you're looking at a list of
Yeah,
people that could be
could
making
be
lists of someone
the
who's
cheese is
clearly
seeing off
murdering
your
people.
cracker, mate.
Right, exactly. Like you come up to me and say that, I'll fold your clothes whilst you're still in them, pal. Like what?
So suspect number 4 is actually the guy that took me down this whole rabbit hole in the first place, and his name is George Chapman, and he is the poisoner. Now, I'm going to go into his details a bit more later on, um, but I'll give you an outline of him right now.
Okay.
He was born Seweryn Klosowski in Poland. Chapman later became notorious for poisoning 3 of his wives. After his conviction, some investigators wondered whether he had graduated from knife murders to poison. Notably, he lived in Whitechapel during the Ripper period. His name entered the ring of suspects because he was a proven serial killer. His known murders used poison, not knives, so ultimately he was rejected as a suspect. I, I do go into his case a little bit later. Suspect number 5 is the Mad Doctor, Francis Tumblety. Tumblety was an eccentric American with a fascination for medicine and a deep, deep distrust of women. He was arrested in London during the Ripper Scare and fled to America shortly afterwards, leading many researchers to consider him a serious suspect. Apparently, his presence in London during the murders was enough to put him on the list of suspects. He fled while under scrutiny, despite the fact that there was no direct evidence connecting him to the crimes.
I mean, I didn't believe. Do you blame him? Like, imagine being like, you might
Quite
get the
honestly.
guillotine.
Suspect number 6, the royal scandal. Prince Albert Victor. One of the most famous theories alleges that Queen Victoria's grandson, Prince Albert Victor, was involved.
I love
The
that.
theory became popular through books and films, but is largely rejected by historians because documentary evidence places the prince elsewhere during the key events. Sensational royal conspiracy theories started this rumour and that no doubt dogged the prince despite him having a very strong alibi. The next suspect on the list is the artist, Walter Sickert. Walter Sickert, a celebrated painter, became a suspect decades after the murders. Writers pointed to his fascination with crime themes and certain alleged personal oddities. The theory gained enormous publicity but remains controversial. He became a suspect because of his well-documented artistic obsession with crime and mystery, although all evidence against him was largely circumstantial. I would hate for Victorian police to walk into my living room. There are skulls everywhere.
Well, you have the weirdest. Like, can I just tell everybody right now? So put a pause. Right, I am doing good vibes and bad decisions, right? We obviously have gas goss and good times, right? And that is predominantly me that does the interviewing there, and Gypsy obviously has buckle up, right? I've got this woman coming on because I'm actually interviewing her. Wait till you see this interview. Wait till you see the stuff in her house. I keep telling people she's got a Death Star in her living room, but it's like some mad death whistle, isn't it?
It's an Aztec death whistle.
Everybody's gonna get to see it. I've got a picture of it. I got the scoop. We're all in. go to Gas Gossip and Good Times. It'll be uploaded this week. You'll be able to see it. You will see all of the obscure, weird, scully things this lady has in her house. Now, if
I cannot
anybody,
imagine anyone would be interested in my life. I'm
bitch, if
pretty
the Ripper, if the
real.
Ripper police walked into your house, you'd be walking the plank. What do you mean? Like, what? They'd be like, any final words? You'd be like looking for Mr. Jingles on the Mile. Like, your whole house is just full of shit. Out of the two of us, you're going to be the one getting the guillotine, boo.
That's very, very true, to be fair.
And listen, I don't care what anybody else says out there. That is a fair statement. I will take that to the whole grave, right?
It
Until
is a
you've
fair
been in that
statement.
house, our entire house is like a witch's play tent.
And if you walk into my bedroom, there's well in excess of 300 books on murder mysteries and other such.
Learning how to be a serial killer on the fly is what she's doing. And I mean, I'm
So,
fine because she loves me. It's her other half that should be
yeah,
terribly concerned.
yeah, I think it should be. It should be, to be fair.
But I just feel like that's on him. He's lucky we're not the Ripper police.
Right?
Right? Aye, definitely. But anyway, that's enough for me. I'm going to sit back down now. She can take back over. I was just putting in with that little tidbit of information for everybody in the house. So that I was giving everybody enough time to get up and go pee and do all that thing. You know what I mean? I
Perfect.
am kind, considerate,
Perfect.
and caring. This is Whitechapel Weekend. Let's get back to it. Come on, boo.
So now we have suspect number 8, the lover. This is why I say they should be tarot cards.
It makes me think of that Kevin Bloody Wilson. I'm a lover, not a fighter, and I'd rather than fight.
So, suspect number 8, the lover, Joseph Barnett. Barnett's story reads like a tragedy. He had been the partner of Mary Jane Kelly, the Ripper's final canonical victim. Some theorists propose that jealousy or obsession drove him to kill. Unlike many suspects, he unquestionably knew one victim personally. He became a suspect because he could be directly linked to Mary Jane Kelly, but there was no reliable evidence connecting him to the other murders. Suspect number 9, the merchant.
What's a merchant?
Salesman.
Thank you.
James Maybrick. A Liverpool cotton merchant, Maybrick entered Ripper law through controversial Maybrick Diary, which purportedly contained a confession. The diary's authenticity has never been accepted by mainstream historians. While his alleged diary confession put him under the proverbial microscope, there were serious questions about the diary's origin. Ultimately, there was no real evidence against him. And then we come to suspect number 10, Dr. Thomas Neil Cream. Potentially the most evil one on this list, I have to say. If any suspect seemed to step directly from the pages of a Victorian horror novel, it was Dr. Thomas Neil Cream. A trained physician, Cream became infamous as a serial killer who used poison rather than a knife. He was convicted of murdering women with strychnine and was eventually executed in 1892. Because he was a known killer with a medical background, some later writers suggested he might also have been Jack the Ripper. His known crimes: Cream's victims were generally young women whom he poisoned with strychnine. After the deaths, he sometimes attempted to extort money from innocent people by threatening to accuse them of the crimes. His combination of intelligence, manipulation, and willingness to kill made him one of the most unsettling murderers of the Victorian era. Of all the suspects listed so far, Dr. Cream was probably the suspect that fit the popular profile of Jack the Ripper. He was a proven serial killer.
And he's out there like threatening people and saying, if you didn't give me money, I'm going to tell people you're Jack the Ripper.
No, he was killing people and then threatening their families, saying he was going to accuse them of killing them.
Oh.
So he possessed the medical training fitting to contemporary theories that Ripper had anatomical knowledge. The strongest argument against Cream is that his known murders were committed by poisoning, a method entirely different from the brutal knife attacks associated with the Whitechapel murders. Additionally, modern researchers generally regard the evidence linking him to Jack the Ripper as weak. So we have more suspects, and I've called these the Stranger Gallery because there's no real information. I didn't
Did
get
they
too
just
much.
say the evidence against that guy was weak? So what? At the first, they
Against
said.
him as Jack the Ripper was weak.
Oh, I was going to say because I'm not being funny, but 5 minutes ago they were accusing somebody who had mental health issues and might be a bit of a crackpot of being Jack the Ripper just because.
Yep.
Oh, the
So
gumption.
numerous other names have appeared in Ripper investigations and later theories, but I want you to pay attention to the names: Jacob Levy, Chaim Hyams, Carl Feigenbaum, Frederick Deeming, David Cohen, R. Donston Stevenson, James Kelly, Dr. John Williams, William Henry Berry, Francis Craig is a modern theory, but most of those names are Jewish.
Well, I'm not
Each
being
suspect.
funny, but which by the way doesn't happen very often because I'm hilarious. But each of the what you're saying is with them being Jewish, there is a massive conspiracy theory, right, and it's everywhere. That the Jews run the world. They own the news companies, they own paper companies, they own TV stations, they control what goes on in the media, they control what news travels down to us, they control all of that sort of thing. So again, it just shows you that the conspiracy against Jewish people still goes on now, but it actually was going on in 1888. Do you not think that's wild?
It honestly doesn't surprise me. Um, each suspect has advocates and critics, yet none has been conclusively identified as the killer. Somewhere in the shadows of Whitechapel, may have walked a disturbed barber, a doomed barrister, a royal scandal, an eccentric doctor, or a poisoner who hid behind a medical degree. Aaron Kaminsky, Montague Churuit, George Chapman, Francis Tumblety, Walter Sickert, Thomas Neal Cream, each has worn the mask of Jack the Ripper at one time or another. Yet when the fog rolls in over the East End, the truth remains as elusive as it was in 1888. The greatest mystery of Victorian London still has no final answer. The police interviewed thousands of people, investigated hundreds, and detained dozens during the Whitechapel murders, yet nobody was ever charged as Jack the Ripper. Modern historians generally agree that the evidence against every suspect remains incomplete. More than 130 years later, the case survives because there is no definitive answer, only a gallery of possible faces behind a single terrifying name. In the end, the greatest suspect in the Jack the Ripper story may be uncertainty itself. No matter how many theories emerge, the murderer who haunted Whitechapel in 1888 still walks history without a confirmed identity. And so, as the fog rolls across the cobbled streets of Whitechapel and the gas lamps burn low against the gathering darkness, we bring part one of our journey to a close. Tonight, we have walked the same streets trodden by the victims and their killer. We have witnessed the poverty and desperation of Victorian London's East End, explored the lives of those caught in the shadow of fear, and followed the unfolding horror that would give birth to one of history's most infamous criminal legends. Yet, despite everything we have uncovered, the greatest question remains unanswered. Who was Jack the Ripper? Was he a local man who blended effortlessly into the crowds of Whitechapel? A respected professional hiding a monstrous secret? A drifter, a madman, a predator who vanished as mysteriously as he appeared? More than a century later, the identity of the killer remains hidden behind a veil of speculation, suspicion, and myth. But our investigation is far from over. In part two, we will move beyond the murders themselves and delve into the lives of the men who have stood under the harsh light of suspicion. From troubled eccentrics and asylum inmates to doctors, businessmen, and aristocrats, we will examine the most compelling suspects ever put forward in the hunt for Jack the Ripper and weigh the evidence for ourselves. Until then, Keep an eye on the shadows, listen closely to the whispers of the past, and remember that some mysteries refuse to die. Thank you for joining us in part 1 of the Whitechapel Weekend Ripper Files. We'll see you again in part 2, where the hunt for the identity of Jack the Ripper truly begins. Until then, good night, and mind the fog.
Good vibes and bad decisions. Oh, good vibes and bad decisions. Doopsie says check the facts. Quinn says tell me that again. Good vibes and bad decisions.